Hi, Justin from Spalted Stack Studio, and in this video we're going to make a custom flag case. The first thing we're going to do is cut our A and B sides. Now we want to make sure that we get a nice continuous grain on these sides because they're going to be the visible sides. We really don't need to focus on the hypotenuse side because that's going to be where the flag case sits and it's not really going to ever be seen. If we really wanted to make this continuous grain all the way around, we need 8/4 material, and that would cost significantly more, especially with an exotic piece like wenge. In my design, I have bird's eye maple going as a strip in the center of the wenge. However, I could not find any good bird's eye maple anywhere, and unfortunately I had to resort to using a veneer. So in order to get some nice clean cuts, I went ahead and used some double-sided tape, taped a couple layers of veneer in between two pieces of plywood. I'll then use that as a clamp and rip down the veneers. And now this method isn't going to be perfect. You're still going to have some pieces that tear out, some ugly pieces, but I got a bunch of this stuff and it wasn't too expensive, so I'll just do a bunch of extra pieces and pick out the best looking ones. I'm also going to try to line up two pieces that look very similar, so that way it still retains that continuous grain going over the top part of the flag case. And thankfully with this bird's eye maple veneer, a lot of the pieces look like they would have matched perfectly, so I didn't struggle too much trying to find a piece to match and give that waterfall edge look. Next, I gotta cut the dado going through each piece where the veneer will sit. Now we're going to take our time with this, and I don't have it in the video, but I did a lot of test cuts to get this as a perfect fit. Using a veneer, there's not much room for sanding, so we need it to be absolutely perfect. The width has to be perfect, the depth has to be perfect. We can't afford any errors on this. Once I run the dados, I can go ahead and glue it in the veneers. Now we need to be careful on our squeeze out. We don't want too much. And if we do, we need to wipe it off with a towel because, again, we don't have very much room for sanding or scraping off the glue. It's very easy to go through veneers. I also used a piece of 8/4 material with some boxing tape to give me a nice flat surface to clamp down the veneer. Now we can move to the table saw and cut our miters. Now to cut these miters, we're actually going to have to use a special method. And if you're not super familiar with table saws and most miter saws, this part can get a little confusing. When you're looking at your angle of your blade, it'll normally start at 0 and move over to 45 in most cases, I believe. However, that's not necessarily an accurate measurement. The blade is in 90 degrees from what you're cutting, so it's not at 0 degrees, it's at 90 degrees. So generally you have to subtract that number from 90 degrees to get the angle that you're cutting. So in this case, I need to cut 22.5 degrees, which means I would have to move my table saw blade to 67.5 degrees. Well, the farthest I can move it is only 45 degrees, so this angle is going to exceed the native capabilities of my table saw. So in order to cut this angle, we're going to have to make something called a tenon jig, and that's going to hold the piece vertical. So it's no longer perpendicular to our blade, but parallel. Now we can move the blade over 22.5 degrees, and it'll give us a 22.5 degree cut. When we load our workpiece into our jig, we want to make sure it's perfectly square and it's held very tightly. I would suggest using a clamp and some double-sided tape. Any deviation from the angle is going to create a gap, and in a workpiece this small, that gap is going to stand out. These pieces are also already cut to length, so I don't want to remove any material and change the overall length. So I'll have the fence pushed back just a little more than I need to, and I'll slowly walk that piece up to the blade until I get a nice sharp corner. Once I get that corner established, I don't need to move my fence again for the rest of the pieces. Once I get the short sides cut, I'll use some blue tape and a square clamp to hold everything in place. I can then get a measurement and figure out the length of the hypotenuse. Now mathematically, I already know what that length is. However, we want to double check because even if we're off a teeny bit on our angle or our length, it's going to create a gap. And again, with the piece this small, any gap is going to stand out a lot. Now that we got our pieces cut to size, we can go ahead and run our rabbet for our back plate. This is a pretty arbitrary number. In my case, I'm doing about 1/4 of an inch because I'll be using a 1/4 inch hardboard to hold the flag in place. But that may vary depending on what kind of stock you want to use. Now to start the glue up, I'm going to do this at my miter stand because it has the longest fence, and I want to make sure that all these pieces are perfectly aligned with each other. I'll then use some blue tape to hold everything in place. And once I get everything aligned, I'll go ahead and move it back to my workbench because I don't want to get a bunch of glue on my miter stand, even though this thing gets beat up as it is. Off camera, I pre-soaked my end grain with a little bit of wood glue just to give it some extra support when I do this glue up. I'm not going to be adding any splines, which normally I would, but there's no real reason to have that kind of structural integrity as this is just a display case. Throwing in splines would have really altered the look of this, and considering I had to use a veneer, I didn't have enough room to round over the edges and make it look decent. Also, when I was assembling it, the tape really didn't hold it quite as tight as I wanted it, so I just glued some angled pieces onto the tape with some CA glue and use that to help pull everything together with the clamp. Building the face frame was very similar to the rest of the project, so I'm not going to bore you with all that. To start with this, I'm going to go ahead and run the rabbet, and this will be what pops into the frame that we just built and holds everything in place. As for the depth of the rabbet, I'm actually going to use a padauk to determine that. I want this to be a nice square border going around the flag case, so the depth is just going to be taken off enough to make that padauk a nice square piece, which ended up being about half the thickness of the piece. Other than that, it doesn't really matter how deep that is. As long as the visuals look good, it's only there to increase the surface area a little bit and to help everything snap into place and make sure that it aligns with the rest of the build. And here I kind of messed up a little bit. When we were cutting the previous miter, that was the thickness of the material. Here it's the width of the material. And this ended up being too thick for my saw blade. Even raising the saw blade all the way up, I wasn't able to fully cut the material. So we're going to have to change methods a little bit and move to the miter saw. Thankfully, the method at the miter saw is relatively similar. I just taped down a piece of material, squared it up with the blade, and then used that piece as the fence. Doing this allowed me to get the angle for the 22.5 degrees. Now, I really don't like doing this because I don't have very much support, and as you can see, I have to kind of hold it in place with double-sided tape and make sure that I'm holding it in place with my hand as well. Not something I really like doing, so in situations like this, I try to stay towards a table saw. It's a little safer for me, but this is an alternative method. Off camera, I went ahead and glued the face frame together and put it into our outside frame of our flag case. In my initial plans, I wanted to put the glass inside of a dado and essentially make it a floating panel. However, I decided against this because I want this piece to last generations, and if some accident happened and the glass was to break as a floating panel, it would pretty much be impossible to fix. So instead, I opted to just silicone the glass in the back, and that was plenty to hold it in place. You can't tell any difference from looking at it in the front, and if anything was to happen to it, it's completely repairable. Now, this is my first time doing anything like this, and I definitely went overboard on the silicone. There was no reason to put as much as I did into it. A couple dabs would have been plenty. But I did want to make sure there was no rattle in and all that stuff, but yeah, it was definitely overkill. Anyways, there you have it. It's a pretty simple build, still fun, and I really enjoy working with the exotic woods. don't get to do it all that often. Stuff is pretty expensive to be working on large scale. But nonetheless, it was a very fun build, and I was really happy with how everything turned out. At the time I'm uploading this video, I'm actually only about 13 subscribers away from hitting my goal of 1,000. So if you are watching this, please like and subscribe and help me hit that 1,000. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video.